I will be presenting a particular approach for the governance of emerging technologies for incorporation of ethics and human rights considerations. Actually, what I will be presenting is a strategic model for incorporating ethics and human rights in technology governance. So we're facing emerging technologies, many of them currently in emergence, that raise significant ethics and human rights issues. A plethora of digital technologies, not just artificial intelligence, but many others as well. We have new biotechnologies of many kinds, new materials, smart materials, advanced materials that also have major implications and raise ethical issues, and new energy and environment technologies. So with this age of rapid innovation, we are facing many ethical and human rights challenges as a result. So what needs to be done to meet those challenges? Well, as an outcome, we want a situation in which new technology lives up to ethics and human rights standards, both regarding their development, deployment, and use. So that's the outcome that we want. But the question is how to achieve this. I will be presenting a model which I call ETCOM, a normative multi-stakeholder model for the co-evolution of emerging technology and ethics. So several things to note about it. This is a normative model. So it's a model that prescribes how ethics and human rights considerations on the one hand and emerging technology would ideally co-evolve. It is a multi-stakeholder model because it involves all the stakeholders, and particularly all the technology actors, those who have a role in shaping outcomes, shaping technologies, their development, deployment, and use. And it is a co-evolutionary model, meaning that it looks at different stages of emergence of emerging technology, and then also different stages at which different actions are needed by different actors to incorporate ethics and human rights considerations. So let's start with thinking about emerging technologies. Technologies undergo a life cycle. That is, there's a time when they do not exist yet. Then there is, of course, basic and then applied research. Then there is early development, resulting in prototypes, and then breakthrough, leading to increasingly rapid innovation in this, where the technology, the new techniques being developed leads to different applications, different products in different application domains, leading to ultimately a mature technology. So you see here at the y-axis the maturity level of the technology, and then the kind of different stages in the innovation process. So also another model is that you have an R&D stage for emerging technology, then you have an ascent stage where it starts being introduced to market and becomes more and more dominant. Then you got your maturity stage, eventually followed by decline. So emerging technology is then technology that is developed in R&D stages, especially the later R&D stages, and the ascent stage, the kind of early market, when it's early in being brought to market and not fully mature yet. Also relevant here to get some more detail on the early emergent stages of emerging technology. We have the technology readiness level scale, also used by the European Commission, which specifies the different R&D stages, going from basic research, basic principles observed and reported, TRL1, to ultimately TRL9, system proven in operational environment. And then you need certain further steps to bring it to market, and then becomes applications that can be used in different contexts. So I think some of these details are important then to start thinking about ethics and where we want our ethics to come in, and our human rights considerations, and how to do that. So in the outcome model, we look at these different stages, the different R&D stages from TRL 1 to 9, and then the ascent phase before full maturity of the technology. So those are successive stages, successive over time. And in the outcome model, we then say what kind of ethical and human rights considerations and activities are needed at different stages in this process. And in the outcome model, there are 5 such stages at which different ethics considerations come in. So we have the assessment stage, the ethics assessment stage, which would take place during TRL 1 through 5 in the R&D stage. Roughly, this is all very roughly. What I call the early guidance stage, which takes place also in R&D during TRL 7, 8 approximately. Then operational guidance, TRL 8 and 9, and then what we call the intermediate and late institutionalization stages, where ethics and human rights considerations are institutionalized. So the institutionalization is not necessarily the technology, although technology as well, but also the ethics becomes institutionalized. This takes place during early and late ascent phases of the emerging technology. So let me go into a bit more detail on those different stages then. So in the assessment stage, the ethics assessment stage, you get early identification of ethical issues with the emerging technology and initial assessment. So this is still happening. The idea is at the stage where many products and applications coming out of the technology field are not known yet, because we're still in earlier TRL stages. But there's already a view on the kind of products that may come out, and the applications, and there are already ethical issues that have to do with maybe the basic techniques and the general nature of that technology that can be considered. So this is a time where you can start identifying and worrying about ethical issues. So here you start thinking about these ethical issues, general ethical issues, but also maybe ethical issues for possible future applications coming out of the technology. And this would mainly be carried out by ethicists, this kind of ethics assessment, but also the technology developers, the researchers and developers at this stage could also start signaling some of these ethical issues. So here the emphasis is on kind of signaling the ethical issues and doing kind of early ethics assessment of their nature and implications. Then later on in the R&D process, later TRL stages, we need to start developing guidelines, ethics guidelines for research and development, especially when it's increasingly clear what the ethical issues are, both those that play during R&D, but also ones that concern future applications and impacts. We want to have ethics guidelines for R&D, but also more generally for all of society, so-called general ethics guidelines for all of society, because the technology is already becoming closer to market. And so you want to think about, well, what kinds of ethical issues will society have to confront? And what guidance do we need for those? And at this point also, it's possible to develop or amend professional ethics codes for the R&D actors. Just before the technology hits the market, the very last TRL stages, you already can be going to operational guidance, the operational guidance stage, where ethics guidelines and ethics guidelines developed in the early stages would be operationalized and implemented for, first of all, for different kinds of products being developed in that technology field, also for different actors, not just the R&D actors, but also the deployers and the users, and for different application domains. For example, the application towards medicine that is being shaped, applications towards other fields, industry, education, defense. You need to think in more detail about ethical issues. Many more ethical issues come to the fore as the technology starts to lead to many different products and applications. This is also a point then where you want to make those ethics guidelines usable and operational. And also at this stage, it's becoming increasingly clear who's going to be involved with this technology, who the technology actors are, not just the R&D actors who develop the technology, but also the deployers, the users, regulators, CSOs. At this stage, you want those actors to get together and discuss their respective responsibilities. How do you divide and distribute moral and social responsibility for these technologies and their application? Then we get the intermediate institutionalization stage. This is a stage when the technology has hit the market, it's becoming increasingly influential in society. More and more applications become clear, more and more impacts also on society become clear. This is when you need to institutionalize your ethics considerations in the sense of maybe turning them into regulations, into standards, developing institutionalized forms of ethics assessment and ethics policies. So different instruments by which you start institutionalizing practices in such a way that ethics and human rights considerations are being considered in a systemic way. And then finally, in the late institutionalization stage, this is just before or at the point when the technology is fully mature, you get your final and full development of your institutional support structures for ethical practice. And ethical practice becomes normalized. It becomes so integrated with other practices that it's less and less distinguishable as a separate category called ethics. So you get within the R&D practice, you have incorporated ethics criteria in such a way that they become part of normal practice. And also in deployment and use stages, you got your practices in which that is standardly incorporated. That doesn't, of course, apply to all ethical issues, because there are maybe tougher or more contentious ethical issues with conflicting values that cannot easily be integrated in a standard way in practice. In that case, you need ethics assessment and maybe ethics reflection or debate procedures for those kinds of ethical issues that need further reflection and discussion. So this is kind of the general model I'm presenting. So it's a model that's, again, multi-stakeholder, because this involves all the stakeholders, especially all the technology actors, both relating to the development, deployment, and use. It's evolutionary, with different stages in the evolution of technology requiring different actions and processes regarding ethics and human rights. And so I've tried to give some detail of this at a more general macro level. What I will do after the break is start going into detail at lower levels of description. So the meso and micro level, looking more details at actors, the tools that they will be using to incorporate ethics and human rights considerations, and how their collaboration, their roles and responsibilities, and what then is needed at these different stages in the emergence process of an emerging technology. So what I want to do now is I kind of sketch this at a macro level, right? So I said in general terms, at these stages of the evolution of emerging technologies, we want these kinds of ethics practices taking place. But I didn't say much about any individual actors or organizations or any specific actions and events. So that's what I want to do now. I want to kind of move from the macro level at which I sketched this model to meso and micro levels, where I will be modeling the technology actors, their responsibilities, the methods that they use to address and incorporate these ethics and human rights issues. And I will do that again for these 5 stages in the evolution of emerging technologies. Not initially, I won't initially go into the stages. I will first be identifying their actors and their responsibilities and methods more generally, and then bring it back to the 5-stage model. So this is about a multi-stakeholder strategy. And for those of you who were present in the AI session, yes, this was inspired on the multi-stakeholder strategy for AI, but generalized for emerging technologies in general. So the multi-stakeholder strategy here is a detailed strategy for the ethical development, deployment, and use of emerging technology, in which we identify all the technology actors, the kind of methods and tools that these actors require to contribute to ethical emerging technologies. And we want to analyze how technology actors can assume relevant roles and responsibilities, and how they can acquire and start using the relevant methods that they need for contributing to ethical practices. So the technology actors that we distinguish that are usually at play for an emerging technology are, first of all, technology developers, including both researchers and developers, either in universities or in industry. We got your various technology development or development support organizations. So those are organizations that support research and development in some way. So that could be trade associations, it could be funding organizations, it could be various, could be science academies, all those kinds of organizations. We got then organizations that deploy, sell, and service technology. We got organizations that use the technology. We got governance organizations, standards organizations, educational organizations, media organizations, civil society, and organizations, importantly here, of course, that work on ethics and or social impacts. That is the assessment of social impacts. So these are, we think, the main players in this play. And let's now move to the kind of tools and methods that these players require. So here we distinguish between 8 types of methods. So methods, by this we mean any kind of usable means by which actors are better able to address ethical and human rights issues and incorporate them into practices. So these are, first of all, methods for incorporating ethics and human rights into research and development of technology. So those methods would be aimed at technology developers and support organizations as the primary users of those methods. Then we have methods to incorporate ethics into the deployment, the selling, and the servicing of technology. So those would be aimed at organizations that deploy, sell, and service technology, obviously. Similarly, methods to incorporate ethics into the use of emerging technologies, aimed at organizations that use the technology. Corporate responsibility policies and cultures that support ethical development, deployment, and use would be a more general method that we here want to mention separately. Then we got a whole variety of soft law and hard law to support ethics and human rights considerations. You got your national and international ethics guidelines, ethics standards, ethics certification, can also be incorporated in more general standards or guidelines or certification, the ethical considerations as well. Then we have methods aimed at education, training, and awareness raising. So educational methods, training methods, methods for policy and regulation, and methods for in-depth ethical and social analysis of emerging technologies and their impacts. So what we've done for other technologies, the specific technologies that we've studied in the SIENNA project, is that we have been very much focused on developing some of these methods because we think it's often a matter of actors not having the right types of tools to properly address ethical issues and incorporate them into their practices. So if we go into a bit more detail then, if you look, for example, at methods for incorporating ethics into research and development, primary methods here, according to us, are research ethics guidelines. So these have been developed for some technologies in the past, but for a lot of technologies, we don't have good research ethics guidelines currently. Ethical impact assessment methodologies. These are methodologies that don't just allow us to do ethical analysis of emerging technologies, but also to do so considering possible future impacts. This is also something that you need at earlier stages in R&D, when you don't know yet for sure what the future applications and impacts are. Ethics by design approaches, that's a fairly new development. We developed one for AI, but we believe that this can be generalized for other technologies. And here also codes of professional conduct. So deployment and use, I'll go over this rather quickly. Here also we have operational ethics guidelines and protocols for deployment and use, both technologies used to enhance organizational processes or technologies used in products and services. We have things like end user guidelines and ethics guidelines and protocols for servicing and maintaining technology. Methods for corporate social responsibility, we want to mention separately because they have such a comprehensive effect on organizations. So we think it's important to include technology ethics considerations and human rights considerations in CSR strategies. And proper implementation of that would require that there's a common culture of responsibility being fostered in organizations. So the broader CSR strategy, we think, is instrumental for being able to incorporate more specific ethics guidelines and considerations regarding emerging technology. Then we have national and international ethics guidelines, standards, and certifications. These are also important tools that are being developed by various international organizations that specialize often in doing that. Educational institutes would be the ones developing courses and modules that cover key ethical issues with regard to the emerging technology. And media organizations and government would communicate ethical issues with the public in sufficient detail. And finally, we have policy and regulation. So what kind of policy and regulations would we need? And we have the studies of the ethical and social impacts. Oh, that shouldn't say AI and robotics. We mean here technology in general. So if we then apply this kind of lower level of description view of the relevant actors and methods to these 5 stages that we've initially described at a higher level, these 5 stages of co-evolution of technology, ethics, and human rights. So then in the early development stage, we have the ethics assessment stage. Here, the key technology actors are the technology developers and support organizations, ethicists, social scientists, and media actors. Why those actors? Well, the technology developers, of course, are active developing the technology at this point. So they can play a role in kind of identifying, being early identifiers of ethical issues in their work. Ethicists can also help identify and analyze these issues. Social scientists can start anticipating future developments and impacts of the technology. And media actors can start communicating these ethical issues to a larger audience of stakeholders. And at this stage, what we especially need, well, we don't need a lot of specific methods at this point, except for methods of ethical analysis, impact analysis perhaps, but we especially need a general sensitivity of the different actors to ethical issues, which could be fostered by good ethics education, especially also for the technology developers. And ethicists here move to ethical analysis of the emerging technologies, and journalists stimulating public debate. So then we move to the early guidance stage. So this is when the technology is still in the making, not ready for market yet, but a bit further along. The key technology actors here would be technology support organizations that where they start thinking about these ethical issues and how they should play at a more sectorial level in R&D. Also, governmental and intergovernmental organizations should start thinking about ethics guidelines and units working in ethics and research, ethics committees, national ethics committees, also thinking about ethical guidance of these technologies. We're still in the R&D stage, and how to deal with the ethical issues. So then we get the operational guidance stage, where basically all technology actors have a role. So you get new technology actors, the regulators here come more into view, the technology deployers and users. And so they also have to start thinking about these ethical issues and what they mean for their practice. It's the same for standards organizations, certification organizations. As the products and applications start hitting the market, all these actors have to start incorporating ethics and human rights considerations, and also working together, agreeing on distribution of responsibilities and ways of cooperating. At this point, there's a growing societal understanding of the ethical issues as the technology becomes closer to entering everybody's lives. Intermediate institutionalization. Here we especially need the governmental and standard organizations where new legislation and regulation needs to be put in place for these technologies. You need your technology standards. This is probably the moment that we're at now for artificial intelligence, for example. I think we're now at early ascent in intermediate institutionalization stage. All technology actors here start considering how to implement strategies also for everyday ethical practice, incorporating ethics and human rights considerations in normal practice. And finally, late institutionalization, where key technology actors, well, all the actors are still relevant, but especially also here, educational actors have a role, and technology support organizations, because education actors, because here it becomes clear what is needed in terms of education and training to ensure that people have the right kinds of knowledge and skill to incorporate ethical considerations in practice. And technology support organizations can further support institutionalization and implementation of ethical and human rights considerations. And also governments at this point can kind of look around and see if ethical and human rights issues have sufficiently been taken into account through self-regulation, and if that's not the case, they can enact additional regulations, policies, and laws.